to discover truth today, or are there serious problems? The moderator, Professor Joshua P. Dar, has explored and researched whether there is a future for opinion journalism in today's media marketplace, or is it even worth saving? He is co-author of a recently published book, Homestyle Opinion: How Local Newspapers Can Slow Polarization. He is also Associate Professor of Political Communication at the Manship School of Mass Communication and Department of Political Science at Louisiana State University. He is also the Associate Dean of Research and Strategic Initiatives at the Manship School. And from 2022 to 2024, he will be a Carnegie Fellow conducting research on the connection between local media and political polarization. Our wonderful panelists are Bina Venkatraman. She is editor-at-large in the Boston Globe opinion section. From 2019 to 2022, she served as editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, leading its editorial board and overseeing its opinion section. She also speaks widely on climate change and was a former advisor to President Obama. She is author of the book, The Optimist's Telescope: Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. We also have Bruce Putterman, the Connecticut Mirror's publisher and chief executive officer. Launched in 2010, the Connecticut Mirror is a source for in-depth news and reporting on public policy, government, and politics in the Nutmeg State, as well as for other areas that may touch on the topics they cover. Dana Warmold is editor-in-chief of the New Hampshire Bulletin. It is an independent nonprofit news organization dedicated to keeping the people of the Granite State informed about the issues that matter most, particularly public policy and politics. There's also Mark Levy. He is the founder and editor of online news site Cambridge Day, serving Cambridge, Massachusetts, and surrounding communities. He's been in journalism for more than 2 decades, mainly in New England, as a reporter, columnist, copy editor, and editor. Joining us as well is the Honorable John Nazzaro, a former Connecticut Superior Judge, and he served from 2007 to 2018. He is now an attorney in private practice. Before attending law school, Judge Nazzaro was a network news reporter, and for 10 years, co-hosting a cable TV public affairs program, The Cutting Edge, that has also examined conflicts and issues related to news, truth, and opposing views. So I'd like to hand this over, to Josh to take up the discussion.
All right, thanks so much. I'm excited to get into this topic because very little has been more apparent about our politics than that media and government are closely connected, that the fate of one is tied to the fate of the other. And from a perspective of a researcher, it's very clear that local news in particular, the more the better. If you have better, stronger local news, you have better accountability from our representatives, you can encourage positive political conversations, businesses behave better, members of Congress work harder. A lot of the things we say we want come from a strong local news environment. My own research on this shows that local news, when it becomes more local, can reduce or at least flatten polarization. We studied a newspaper in California that dropped national politics from its opinion page for 1 month and did before and after surveys in that community to find that polarization slowed down compared to a community where the newspaper did not change. So that was, as he said, homestyle opinion. But again, my research and the research of many, many others has shown that the future of local news is intimately tied to the future of American government. And that means we need to understand what the economics of it are. We'll talk about the marketplace of ideas, but we're also going to talk about the marketplace because local news needs to survive economically. Are we going to have partisan politics or local solutions? Are we going to have opinion sections or unregulated Facebook groups? These are important questions that we face both as people interested in journalism, but also as a nation going forward. So I'll start the conversation with talking about opinion journalism in particular. What is the role of opinion journalism in today's changing and adapting models of local news? Is it a chance to attract readers and start important conversations? Or is it a danger for news organizations' reputations and their bottom lines? So I'll hand that over to our panelists.
I'm happy to start since I've just been leading an opinion section of a paper that is both local, but also to some extent regional and national in its identity and sort of scope. And I think, I feel like the answer you set up was an either or, and the answer might be yes, both, in my view. And so I think when we have this environment of a cacophony of voices where anyone and everyone can put their opinions out on Reddit, on Twitter, in the blogosphere, through punditry, the bar of what should be published in newspaper or news organization opinion sections, I think, needs to be higher. The filter needs to be tighter. And the standard that we ought to be using and should be using to build trust with our readers is that we are a place where you get rigorously reported and evidence-based opinions. And I also think that people are looking for more than just diatribes and opinions that reflect the latest outrage over whatever political headline there might be. And I think, Josh, your research kind of bears this out. They're looking for points of view that offer a way forward through thorny problems, whether those are political problems or civic problems or social problems. And I think increasingly, I'm interested in an opinion journalism that strives towards pointing people towards solutions or surprising alternative ways of looking at issues that don't fall into either of the polar camps. That said, a lot of opinion journalism and the sort of incentives, since we were talking about the marketplace around virality and raising subscriptions, you can get a lot more of that. You can drive a lot more of that. For example, when we were covering, the latest outrage of the Trump administration in our pages of the Globe, we could see how sometimes taking a sharp point of view against the White House on its handling of the pandemic led to spikes in virality of those pieces and in even subscription spikes at times. And so there is this kind of tension, I think, between reacting to the news of the day and offering opinions that are measured and that offer people a way of looking at civic problems that is actually productive and demonstrates that there is a way to have productive disagreement.
No, that's a great point. Maybe it can be both, but at the same time, hard to say. Would anyone else like to contribute on that?
I'll chime in as the only non-active professional journalist here, and therefore maybe representing the consuming crowd. I've seen a breakdown, and we all have seen it, in genuine discussion to be educated. And there's a consumer group out there that wants to see and read and hear opinions that are like-minded. And we need to move it to a point where we can have genuine discussion to be educated on the other's point of view. And I think it's vital, therefore, that we have opinion forums where we can exchange. Interestingly, I have three children, last I checked. Two of them are in media. One is at Meta, Facebook, and he's on one level. Another is working for Sinclair Broadcasting, and she's an editor of digital content. So two different mediums. And of course, in the electronic era, I'm not on Instagram and I'm not on Twitter. And I refuse to go there. And I'm a dinosaur. I still do AOL dial-up. But the reality is this is where young people, and many of you are younger than me, are finding their news. And when I talk to my son at Meta, I don't even understand the language. And he's talking about experiences, right? This is the vernacular of the new generation, an experience. What does that mean? So I think it's important to have a forum where we can advance these thoughts in a genuine marketplace if people are looking for a healthy discussion to understand the opposing view. And I think that's lacking.
Thank you. I think opinion pages can provide that.
I can tell you that. Feel free. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please. No, please go ahead.
I can tell you that when I started my site, it was with the thought that I would be sort of smart and cutting. I was inspired by New York Magazine and sort of fact-based opinion, such as you found on the blog of Talking Points Memo at the time. And I tried that, and what I discovered over time is not only that I'm not very good at it, but that it's not what Cambridge, Massachusetts wants or needs. And I think part of that may have been because I tried to do that without having established my credibility first. But ultimately, I have tried to eliminate basically anything interesting from what I do and just be as dry as possible. And whereas I once was excited to have the opportunity to, vent my opinions on an opinion page, a clearly marked opinion page, what I found is that as the world heated up and as there were hotter and hotter takes coming from more and more people, I just had less and less to say. And I would never want to eliminate the opinion page or the opinion essay from a proper news source. But I think that it has to be limited to places where, sorry, let me restate. I think that it does best where the places have established their credibility before they start talking. And I think that's essential and that it's impossible to shortcut that.
Absolutely. Dana, were you wanting to say
Oh,
something?
sure. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, before I was editor of the Bulletin, I was the opinion editor at the Concord Monitor, small newspaper, for 7 years. And, the model for the opinion page there was very much to give a voice to the community through letters to the editor, my turn columns. And I really, that model really appealed to me. I think, I really, that was probably my favorite part of the job beyond, the edit board interviews of politicians and writing editorials, but was really interacting with the readers. Even when it got tense and I had to call and say, I can't run your letter and here are the reasons why, I still felt like there was a lot of value to those conversations. All of that said, by the time I got to the end of those 7 years, I had definitely evolved to the point where I really, at that point, didn't quite know what the value of that was, because I felt like there was no cross illumination. It was shouting, and it was only grasping the opinions that you agreed with and making no effort whatsoever to read the other side and try to see if you could get more clarity on your own position. And so, part of what I do here at the Bulletin, because we're a 501c3, we have some new limitations on the kind of opinion content we can run. I don't run anything by elected officials, for example. And there's some other pieces that I have to be a little more cautious about. And so it's kind of worked out in a way, because I really have come to value expertise. And I think, to Bina's point of just, to see the value of opinion writing when it's rigorously reported as really illuminating, and I think supplementing our news coverage to take it a little bit further sometimes even than our reporters can, through the experts just sort of laying out the argument. I think the Conversation does a good job with that. There are a lot of pieces they do that I like, and a lot of times they really work well with what we're doing at the State House. It's a little harder to find those voices locally. That's been a real challenge for me, just as I try to build up our stable of opinion writers. And I do still get, blind submissions, but it's definitely a different, when you're not sort of out there to give a voice to your community, it's a little more challenging.
I think yes, there are people on the political extremes who are not interested in other people's opinions, and they just gravitate toward their, the echo chamber. But we have an opinion section. It's kind of somewhere between a kind of paid op-ed and letters to the editor. So they're kind of long letters to the editor, op-ed length letters to the editor, if you will. But they don't come from people we commission or work with. They come in over the transom generally. And we do that because we believe, we hope, we think that there are enough people kind of in the middle between the extremes who are interested in reading about other perspectives that it provides value. Connecticut is for all of the perceptions of white picket fences, et cetera, Connecticut's one of the most segregated states in the country. And it has the largest wealth inequality of any state in the country by a considerable margin. And there's problems inherent in that. And the only way that ultimately legislatively, and we're a policy focused news organization, the only way that legislatively we're going to get past that is if people in the suburbs understand the perspective of people in the cities. And if people in the cities understand the perspectives of people in the suburbs and across socioeconomic and racial and ethnic characteristics as well. So that's why we're still committed to opinion. And that's not to say it's not fraught. So I agree with you, Bina. There are potentially, we're a nonprofit. We don't have a lot of money to invest in editing opinion. And so sometimes things slip by that we're a little bit embarrassed about, or we have to address in some way, fielding calls from governor's offices, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of a price, I guess, that we're willing to pay for the opportunity to create a forum and maintain dialogue and allow people throughout the state to get to know one.
It's an excellent point about the resources you need to do opinion well, right? At one level, you're getting submissions from people, and you're just providing a space for the community, but the value comes from, as you say, the editing, the recruiting of writers, the maintenance with those writers. Certainly that was a major part of the book, was how much more work it was for the opinion editor to drop those wire stories for that month. Of course, this is a problem. It really was. And he was retired a year later. But the marketplace for local news is to put it maybe positively, very different than it was a decade or two ago. And there has been a shrinking of readers, a cutting of newsrooms, closures of newspapers. And so the political media looks very different than it did, which calls to my mind, how do we think about media's effects on politics in this newer, different world? And so, like, I'm a professor of political communication, and our students are taught that the media doesn't tell you what to think; it tells you what to think about. This is called agenda setting, right? That the media's power is not necessarily persuasion; it's what's the public agenda. But at a time when local news is declining and alternative national and partisan sources are rising, can the news media still have that influence? Can the media contribute to shaping a collective public agenda?
I'll chime in and just say, the answer to me is absolutely, and I think it's necessary, and to stimulate the discussion on the local level, as you say, in Connecticut, and I don't know where all the viewers are coming from. I presume predominantly New England. Let's face it, we are a one-party state for the most part, right? The Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, and so that drives the discussion. As a former member of the RNC State Central Republican Committee, and I was appointed by a Republican governor, a lot of times as a Republican in the minority, you feel powerless to really make change. And yet every year this is going on in Hartford, and what the media puts out there in terms of the controversies, the fights, et cetera. We have an election upcoming. There are polls about various candidates being ahead by so many points. It's important to constantly stir the pot and to advance both sides, even though we are a one-party state. At one time, I supported political candidates. I'm unaffiliated, I might add, just for fair disclosure, because I feel that to get change, you have to be in there. And the media is so important in setting forth opinions and views, and even those that don't have value, those that are not evidence-based. I think there's value in marching those misguided opinions out there for the reason that it illustrates a body of thought. The reality is not everybody is informed, not everybody's fact-based. We know that all too well. with the prevalence of alternative facts. And this is a segment of our society, and I agree with the statement. I think it was Bruce. We have tribalism. I don't think you use that word exactly, but throughout the state. I mean, what happens in Bridgeport is completely different than what happens in Avon. And we're like two different countries speaking two different languages. And we have to recognize that. And I'm a member of the NAACP. And I find myself sometimes in discussions where there's an inability. There's a desire maybe to want to understand, but to cross certain things that you grow up with and belief systems is very challenging. So that's where the media is especially important.
Yeah, bridging those divides.
Absolutely.
Who else is going to do it? Yeah, agenda setting.
Let me,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry. Let me pave the way for our favorite pastime of giving anecdotes as though they're meaningful. Fairly recently, a reporter for Cambridge Today was asked by me to debunk something that had been out on Twitter and had gotten some response, that our local hospital had been bribing families to put COVID as a cause of death. And that's a relatively widespread conspiracy theory. And also relatively easy to debunk because state law doesn't allow for families to have any say in stating cause of death. There can't be a bribe if the family is not involved in what they'd be bribed for. So we posted this story with a Twitter user who was not even identified by name, but rather by her Twitter handle. And it was such an anodyne piece, and it was so simple, and yet there was a very minor conflagration on Twitter where that Twitter user who had spread the conspiracy theory in the first place and her compatriots just went every aspect of attack that you're familiar with from the past few years on Twitter was rolled out, including one of the commenters, also not going by their real name, trying to dox our reporter by saying, is this even a real person? By finding a previous listing of her name and phone number and asking people to call her to ask if she was real. And I thought that it was amazing that someone who was unwilling to identify themselves were doxing someone by their real name at a place where they could actually be contacted. But I really began to worry about this time that asking for this article to be written had been a really bad move, that we were never going to see daylight from this, and that my reporter was going to be doxxed and injured. And I was really worried. It abated. It finally just broke, and the Twitter rampage stopped. And what I came out of this with was the sense that, yeah, Twitter is where they do that, and that's okay. They will do this for a while and it will break. And when it all comes down to it, our story is what's going to live on when people search for this. Whereas those tweets are going to be gone soon enough. And I realize that doesn't work, because it doesn't work if the tweets keep coming and coming and coming. But at least for this one small story, the wave broke and the story is still up.
No, this is the question with the marketplace of ideas. Should you have to identify yourself walking in, and should everybody have at least something of a equal voice in the back and forth instead of the pile on? It's a good question, and one that we need to know. In the social media era, that's the thing that matters. Bina, you were going to speak before, I believe.
Well, I was actually going to pick up on something Mark said earlier, which is when he was describing this need to build trust and credibility first in the community before offering up opinions. And I think the same can kind of go for agenda setting too. So I think, for one, I don't have even though I feel especially troubled by the evisceration of local newsrooms and the dying out of local news sources, I don't have a particularly nostalgic view that there was once a time where journalism was adequately representing community conversations and community agendas. And so I think one thing that has to happen, or one thing we have an opportunity to do right now, is to build that kind of trust and credibility in a way that's much more authentic. And Dana and Bruce were giving examples of this too, where how does a news organization and its opinion sections, but even its news coverage, better reflect what a community, how a community sees itself, and how does it become an image of how a community can see common ground even between different kinds of groups and different kinds of differences. And I think that to a large extent, news organizations like my own historically have decided there's one notion of the community and one notion of what's on the agenda, and publish that, whether it's what's going on at City Hall, whether it's what's going on in the neighborhoods, in certain neighborhoods and not in others, and certain boardrooms and not in other boardrooms. And I think the credibility and trust question to me is really related to whether people then see us as being the source for accountability journalism, which holds politicians accountable and sets the agenda in terms of what politicians should be covering when we're in an editorial board and we're trying to endorse. It's if we can better reflect what people's values are and they feel identified and they feel a sense of trust with us as journalists, as editors, as reporters and voices, but also as an institution, because we're the fourth estate, we're trying to be an institution in the community, then I think we'll have more success when it comes to leveraging that to set the agenda. And I think one of the big questions, the business model is of course a big question, but I think it's inextricably linked with how do local news organizations do this now? Like, how do we actually bring in those voices from the letter writers? Like, how do we keep that audience flow and engagement really robust? Because audience engagement is this whole category that we think about in journalism now. And on social media, it's just constant engagement, right? No one filters, no one curates. You can constantly be engaged. And I think there's something we have to learn from that modality and bring into a more curated, evidence-based environment in order to be able to earn that trust.
That's a great point. The curation is so important.
So, we don't really aspire, or at least not consciously, don't aspire to set any kind of agenda. I suppose the only agenda that, and maybe this is cliche, that we truly embrace, we position ourselves and try to be nonpartisan. We don't aspire to set a specific agenda. We don't have an institutional voice. We don't do endorsements. And yet we do wind up kind of inadvertently, I suppose, by virtue of the quality of our reporting, the trust that we've built over the 13 years we've been in existence, we do at some level set the agenda. And that's actually extended by the fact that the 14 largest daily newspapers in the state license our content and republish it. So we are the State House press corps for virtually all of the newspapers in the state of Connecticut. So our story selection does wind up setting the agenda, I suppose, to some degree. But, kind of beyond that, just in terms of, there was an early rumor. This is a gubernatorial election year in Connecticut. And there was an early rumor in 2021 about the governor and the governor's wife and her business involved in a company with a state contract. And the Republicans were starting to kind of make an issue of it. And so we decided to kind of take a look at that and clarify what really is the situation there. And, the governor and his wife were not happy with us because they thought we were kind of charging that the governor's wife was somehow doing something unethical. The Republicans maybe not quite as happy because we kind of took an issue away from them because we provided kind of the facts. So I guess at that level, we are helping to set the agenda. I guess I would argue that what's more important from our point of view is that we provide context for readers and elected officials and people in government to understand policy, systems that aren't working, needs that aren't being met. and then let them kind of deal with setting the agenda based on that reporting.
And without you, the reporting wouldn't be happening. I mean, the State House, the shrinkage of State House reporters is amazing. I know here at the Manship School, we're in Baton Rouge in the Capitol, and we have a crew, a class that's the State House reported class, and they publish like 400 articles around the state every year, and kind of are the biggest State House bureau we've got. So in a lot of places, and we're not the only ones, a lot of places this is college student reporting, but it's true. If that basic information doesn't get out, then who knows where the agenda would come from.
I just want to chime in and follow up on Bruce's comment about that situation with Mrs. Lamont and the governor. I think it's so important for the news media to do investigative journalism on issues like that, because when you see those stories about possible bad motive, that's red meat to the masses, right? And it's easy talking points, and who, except for the media, will actually look and delve into the facts. So the Republicans might not have liked the fact that your paper looked into it, but it's important for the public to understand that these are sometimes specious arguments. Personally, I think elected officials, and the ones I've dealt with, and I've been appointed by two different, Governor Malloy, Governor Rell, oftentimes, and you have a governor like Governor Lamont, who reported income, as we know, $56 million last year. These people are not motivated by money and lining their own pockets. That's my personal view. This is not why they seek office. It's other reasons. I submit. That's my belief system. So I think the media looking into these issues and frankly knocking down these thoughts is important, because we have so much misperception out there, and people on both sides, right? There are issues on both sides they raise, and they may seem to have merit, but when you look into the facts, and it's a different story. And I think it's an important responsibility, as Bina said, of the Fourth Estate to keep people honest.
And that's a good setup for my next question, really, which is about what's been in some ways the hottest topic in this area for a couple of years now, and people's, I think, main worry in some ways about the potential collapse of legacy local news is this notion of fake news, misinformation. Certainly, if you're an academic who's been studying this topic and you wanted grant money, you have been trying to study misinformation, because that's where it's been. It's gotten an intense focus. And as you noted, the media can play an important role in fact checking, but what happens when they don't have the time or the ability to chase all the rabbits? And that's really, as the zone has been flooded in recent years, it's an open question and an important one. However, I think there's been a ton of panels on fake news. I wanted to approach it slightly differently and ask, do we talk about fake news and misinformation too much? Is fake news a cause or a symptom of deeper problems in politics and journalism?
I think fake news has lost all meaning at this point. I think it's just a phrase that refers to facts you disagree with. And misinformation, that's a whole other ballgame. To me, that is a big problem and a consistent challenge in reporting. We talk in our newsroom a lot about, Jay Rosen's theory of the truth sandwich. And because I think you do have to report on misinformation, but it has to be done, in the right way. I think the model of the sandwich works pretty well. We're seeing that, we're sponsoring some debates, and so we were at our Senate debate today, and it was chock full of just, misinformation. And, it's, you can fact check it to some degree, as you're going through the debate, but it's really in the reporting that it takes, I think, a lot of skill to say, here's what this person said, here's why it's incorrect. And, and it really, this is the hardest time of year to do that. And it's exhausting because it's there's the days of a politician, being chastened by getting caught in a lie. Those days are over. Now you double down and you triple down. You get your people to echo your lie, and it's just it's a trap for reporters. So yeah, no such thing as fake news, but misinformation, that's a whole other.
I was watching cable TV this morning, and there was a story. I won't mention the network, but they highlighted this story last year about these two armed men with a bulletproof vest going in and pretending to be federal voting machine checkers. And what a scary story. I mean, literally, this guy had a sidearm. We are a couple of weeks away from an election. And I'm thinking, as I'm watching this on television, what effect is this going to have on people who are fearful of all the violence going on around our country? Will it keep them home? Will it cause them to vote by absentee ballot? Will it cause them not to vote at all? So, that story is going to have an effect.
I can give you the short answer to what you're saying is, I was going to say that it used to be a symptom and it's quickly becoming a cause, because unlike what I said earlier about the Twitter wave coming and going, some of those tweets also quoted something called Beckwith News and other purported news sites that I think are getting baked into Google search as much as Cambridge Day is, or Connecticut Mirror, or any other responsible, agency that tries to be responsible. So agreed that fake news as a term doesn't have meaning and misinformation does, but yeah, I think it's going to be with us for a really long time unless there is actually some sort of radical effort to clean it out that I don't see real political will for. And the divisiveness means that there can't be a political will to do it.
That's a catch-22.
Yeah, I think there have always been lies told by all kinds of people, even right yellow journalism. Journalism is not immune to spreading either intentional lies or falsehoods. And so when we talk about misinformation, it's false information that's out there, but there's also disinformation, which are these orchestrated campaigns that are happening now, whether it's the Russian disinformation campaigns to tell a different narrative about the Ukrainian war, or the disinformation campaigns related to election fraud and trying to raise these issues, the specter that we have voter fraud in places we don't have it in the US, and serving particular people's commercial or political aims. These campaigns, I think they're pernicious. I agree with Mark that they're going to be, it's just like going to be a generational problem. We're going to be dealing with this for a really long time. I think it's important to understand it. Those terms maybe aren't important for every single person on earth to know, but I think it's important for people who think about solving problems. I mean, here we are, HKS alumni, think about solving public problems, to understand that we're not just in an environment where it's the same old rumor mill on the street. We're in an environment where lies can get spread in a very concentrated way because of the speed and reach of social media, the speed and reach of our digital platforms, but also because, and the judge mentioned a kid working at Meta, because of the ways in which also we have not created enough tracking and accountability for the platforms for what people see. So we don't even actually know what people see. People are exposed to all kinds of lies, and it's really hard to trace what they saw and didn't see and what led them down these rabbit holes. And there are more and more people, thankfully, writing about this, studying it, looking at it. I think the one piece of hope I'll offer for this dismal picture is that we're at the beginning, right? Like in terms of people's literacy and skepticism, we still have we have generations of people alive today that grew up looking at a newspaper in print, right? And being able to have some semblance of trust in these sort of authoritative sources. And we're in an environment now where Breitbart and all these different sites that can look like news sites, right? That we know that there are these sort of sites that impersonate or sort of try to purport to be credible news sources, and they look format-wise, it's cheap to make them look like any of these, the Concord Monitor, any of these more legitimate news organizations. And so people's ability to parse that and say that which of these are credible news sources, and to be more skeptical about that. I think we're going to get better at that just by necessity, right? People are going to want to know what's happening at the local hospital, and there will be some amount of ground truthing that's possible, at least on these very local issues. And so the local news actually gives me a little bit of hope, and the fact that we're just at the beginning of understanding our own relationship to this kind of information and how we go about verifying it.
No, it's true. There's a generational component, and the younger generations that are most skeptical of things on the internet are also in some ways reading the least local news, at least in terms of legacy local news. So if we could figure out a way to get those to match up, that might be good.
One of our people's at a journalism conference in Austin that started today, and he emailed me a couple of hours ago. Dean Paquette was the keynote speaker in the opening session. And he said the good old days weren't really that good. We were arrogant. We weren't transparent. We didn't go into diverse communities. We didn't grapple with complex issues. If we keep dwelling on the past, we'll never move forward. So, I mean, at some level, to your point, Bina, we have always had fake news. I mean, people in diverse communities, their point of view wasn't represented at all. And that's a form of misinformation or fake news or whatever you want to call it. I guess from my perspective, as the publisher of a 19-person news organization in a small state, there's not a lot I can do to combat misinformation systemically. There's only what we can do as an organization. And I guess all of us, we're preaching to the choir, no doubt, on this call or on this webinar, but so we do what we can. We try to be clear about our reporting processes. We try to be transparent about funders and any conflicts that might exist. We try to be as fair as possible. We make corrections when we need to make corrections. We had to retract a story at one point, and we do that. So I guess for the little guys amongst us, that's what we do. Hopefully it becomes kind of this collective effort that does build trust. And one final thing, I guess, is trust ultimately is about branding and brand. And people turn to the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, whatever, because there is something that's been imbued in that brand over many years of being honest with, or as honest as possible with their readers and their stakeholders, that those brands have developed some sense of trust.
In the chat, there is a chance to ask questions. Nobody has so far, so I'll take a little more moderator privilege. Oh, I guess there is one. A question from Stephen. We need to bring the dialogue into the middle, Judge Mazzaro's observation. How do we foster a patient arena for discussing the issues? How do we make a civic forum that does end up in the middle and not shouting matches, as we've already heard? Has anybody seen a successful version of that? Is it in the curation as Bina talked about?
I've seen examples of I guess what I would say, I was saying this term earlier, I sort of think of it as more productive disagreement, where people can, talk across different kinds of ideologies or political affiliations, but talk about a public problem. And it's not happening. It's not very common in news organizations that this is happening. I think conflict and tension sell and draw. For that matter, it's sort of like as readers, we have a responsibility because we gravitate towards that. And I'm not sure. I think that the idea that the middle is the right place is a normative idea that I don't necessarily share. So the middle is going to shift based on where the spectrum of our politics shifts. So, the country can go really far left in response to a really right president or authoritarian president, right? The country can go really far to the right. And so that wherever that place the middle is, it could change. And now we have very clear polls. And I'm not sure, I can see why there's an appeal to saying the middle is the right place right now. But I think what's more important is that to me, what's more important are the democratic values that I think are kind of the basis of the founding and the basis of the success of our country, which is that lots of ideas and beliefs and ways of approaching problems should be able to coexist, as long as they allow space for others' ideas and others' existence. And so there's a line, right? We're not going to go to Nazism here, but I think that's the kind of discourse and democratic value that, if you want to call that a middle of the road value, I think it's just a truly American value. And that's what I would like to see more organizations trying to stress.
I want to chime in real quick because I know there's another question. I don't know if it's the middle so much, and middle is not necessarily a place you want to be, but what we've seen, and I can cite 2 instances locally in Connecticut. In Groton, you have 2 city councilors who are literally calling the police on one another at a meeting because there's a discussion in the hallway at a break. In Westerly, Rhode Island, he's a friend of mine. You have a person appearing before the Board of Education, which is chaired by his sister, who then calls the police trying to arrest her own brother for speaking at a meeting. We've had a breakdown of the ability to have an intelligent discussion. I'm not saying surrender your values, abandon your post, and somehow compromise your belief system. But we need to be able to engage in the discussion without attacking one another, and for it to disintegrate, to have literally the police department come in and somehow be the arbiter. That's the challenge, I think. And so where does media's role in that process to facilitate more intelligent discussion?
You can still meet in the middle, then walk back to your polls. But while you're in the middle, you can have a talk. All right.
Well, I think the elephant in the room is who owns the media. And in 1934, the FCC said you can limit stations. You can limit broadcast properties. We had the Fairness Doctrine until 1987. There was, it banned bias and it forbade news blackouts. And in 1996, there was the Telecommunications Act, which deregulated, and everything has followed since. I must say that I spent my life in broadcast journalism from Austin, Minnesota to New York on the old independent network news. And the reality is that journalists do not confront, for example, the election deniers. They have lost the ability to look at an issue and follow it up. So that's the only thing that I can say. When Clear Channel owns 850 AM and FM stations, and Rupert Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal and 29 full-powered stations, and affiliated with another 227, then I think the ball game is very close to being over. And thanks for hearing me
Thank
out.
you. No, thank you for that. And we've got a couple more questions in the chat too, which is good. I will tie that in. Just William Monast's question was going to be my next one, is about media literacy, and I think we can tie in ownership to that. What do people? Is there a role for the media to explain what the media does and how the media is structured, and try to increase trust by fostering media literacy, or is that not something the media can credibly do? And part of that is who owns the paper. I mean, that's how that ties in.
I'm pessimistic.
Yeah.
At this point, when I believe we have people who can look across the yard to their neighbors and believe that their satanic pedophiles who are, you know, cannibal satanic pedophiles, even if that person has been their neighbor for, you know, 30 years or whatever. It's just, I don't know how exactly we come back from this moment except to bottom out, which is dark. There has been a little bit of a movement in Massachusetts to return civics courses to our high schools. I think that if nothing else, that's a start. I would encourage that.
No, that's a good point. All right, there are, like I said, a couple more of these. Maybe we have time for one more, and then we can, you know, wrap up the conversation here. There's a couple good ones I got to choose. I guess I'll say two of these. So is the answer here getting back to actual communities, people that know each other? You know, like you say, looking across the yard and actually talking to each other. Who should people be allowed to participate anonymously is one of the questions. And another one is, you know, how can interacting and participating with the local community build trust? I think those are somewhat connected. So is grounding yourself with your audience, reaching out, doing that kind of audience outreach, and making sure that people know who you are and you know who they are. Is that part of the answer to this?
I think it is for sure. You know, we cover the State House, so we spend a lot of time in the hearing rooms and that sort of stuff. And the best stories we write are when we follow the threads of policy in the communities, and that I feel like is how you connect with community. They're part of it. You're not just, the big trap about covering policy is you never leave the State House, and we still run into that here. And so I think there's a lot to that. I think that not only does it build trust, it gives a new, a bigger dimension to the policy story itself. It sounds very simple that, you know, you can't explain policy until you show people how it affects them, but it remains true. And I think you do need to leave the State House. You do need to drive down the roads. And yeah, that's it.
Reluctantly, I grant people anonymity because increasingly in 2022, people are terrified. And if they're terrified, but they don't get to talk, then they're voiceless also. I don't like it. I think it's un-American. I think people should use their names, but again, reluctantly, I grant anonymity.
Understandable. We are running out of time here. There were some good questions I couldn't get to, and I'm sorry for that. It is a regulated forum, and we've got to keep within the hour. But I would like to thank all of our panelists, a real great cross-section here of local news in New England. Thank the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Chapter for putting this together and for inviting me to it. I'm from Newton, Massachusetts, even though I live here in Louisiana, so this feels like a homecoming, even though I'm in my office. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you did too.
And on behalf of the Harvard Kennedy Schools New England Alumni Association, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight too. And we appreciate your enthusiasm in this topic. And there'll be others along the line too, relating to the media and the state of affairs today. So look for our advertisements about them. And thank you, panelists, for your wonderful contributions. They were really enlightening and interesting. And Josh, thanks for taking this down the road. We really appreciate it. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.